Good morning, everybody. It is 7 o'clock. A business boost to help with the cost of living. The Prime Minister talks tax, and is President Putin preparing to make a major announcement to gain ground in Ukraine any moment? All of that on today's show, plus talking to the Foreign Office Minister, Gillian Keegan, very shortly. It's Wednesday, the 21st of September. Businesses to get energy bill discount to help with the cost of living as the PM talks tax in New York, saying she's prepared to be unpopular to boost the economy.
Here at Costello's Bakery near York, I'll be asking small business owners what they need to hear this morning to save them in the face of spiralling bills.
And right now, we're just seeing the Russian President Putin expecting to make a national address with fears he could be making plans to gain ground in Ukraine. Here he is.
Citizens of Donetsk and Lugansk, People Republics, Kherson and Zaporozhye, and other areas freed from the Nazi regime. We'll be talking about the steps of protecting our sovereignty, support of the will and desire of our citizens to determine their future themselves, and about the aggressive policy of part of the Western countries that are trying to keep their supremacy at all costs, and they're trying to block and suppress any independent centers of development in order to force their will in a brutal way to other peoples. The aim of the West is to weaken and destroy. They are openly saying that in '91 they managed to split the Soviet Union, and now is the time for Russia itself, that Russia will have to fall into many regions and areas which are fighting each other to the death. They had those plans for a long time. They supported the bands of international terrorists in the Caucasus. They are encouraging the NATO to come to our borders close, and the total Russophobia and many years of total hatred of Russia, first and foremost in Ukraine, and they made the Ukrainian people cannon fodder and pushed them into the war with our country, having started it already in 2014, using the army against the civilian population and organizing the genocide and blockade and terror against the people who refused to acknowledge the Ukrainian power as a result of the military coup. As usual, they refused to have a peaceful solution of resolving Donbas problems and started claiming the right to use of nuclear weapons. It became clear as before, the second time the large offensive of the Donbas is even inevitable, and the decision of the preemptive military operation was the only decision possible and absolutely necessary, and the main aim of freeing the whole of the territory of Donbas remains without change. The Donbas People's Republic is almost fully cleared of the Nazis. The fight in the Donetsk People's Republic continue, and the occupation regime has made a deep line of defense, and therefore the part of our army and the Donbas military units are using the technology, using the people, and are freeing Donetsk People's Republic step by step, freeing the towns and villages, and helping people who were turned into hostages by the Kiev regime. As you know, the professional army serving under contract are taking part in the special military operation. However, the volunteer units are fighting alongside them. They have different nationalities, professions, and ages. They are true patriots. They are protecting Russia and Donbas upon the call of their hearts. In this regard, the Ministry of Defense was instructed by me in full to determine as soon as possible the legal status of those areas and also the units of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. They have to be the same as the professional military of the Russian army, including the social guarantees, medical and financial supplies. We need to pay special attention to procurement for the units of the Donbas by technology and munitions. And our army, based on the decisions of the Ministry of Defense and the General Command, have freed from the neo-Nazis the considerable territories of Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. As a result, there is a long line of military contact, over 1,000 kilometers. And I want to say that publicly for the first time, after the start of the special military operation, also at the Istanbul negotiations, there was a very positive reaction to our proposals concerning ensuring the security of Russia. But it was obvious that the West was not happy with the peaceful decision. So after reaching certain compromises, they effectively were given a direct order to undermine the negotiations. And the Kiev regime started using new bands of foreign mercenaries and nationalists. And the army, trained by NATO standards and actually commanded by the Western commanders. The repression regime intensified across the whole of Ukraine against its own citizens after the military coup in 2014. The politics of terror and intimidation against Russia becomes more and more barbaric and terrible. I want to stress that most people living in the territories freed from the neo-Nazis, and first of all, they are the Novorossiya historic lands. We're talking Kherson, Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye regions. You have seen the barbarities of the neo-Nazis in the regions captured by them. The Banderas followers and the Nazi mercenaries are torturing the peaceful citizens in Donetsk, Lugansk, People's Republics, Zaporozhye and Kherson areas. Over 7.5 million people lived before the start of the military operation. Many of them were forced to become refugees. Those who are left are constantly bombarded by artillery and rocket attacks on the part of the neo-Nazis, who attack hospitals and schools and create acts of terror against the peaceful citizens. We have no moral right to give people that are dear to us to be butchered, and we need to give them a chance to determine their own fate. The parliaments of the DNR and the LNR and the administrations of Kherson and Zaporozhye regions have decided to hold referendums on joining Russia, and they asked Russia to support such a step. I shall stress we will do all we can to ensure safe conditions for holding the referendums, for people to be able to express their will and decision in their future that will be made by the citizens of the DNR, the LNR, and Zaporozhye and Kherson regions will be supported by us. Dear friends, today our army, as I said, is acting at the military front line, exceeding 1,000 kilometers, and they are facing not just the neo-Nazis, but the whole military machine of the collective West. In this situation, I deem it's necessary to make the following decision, which is appropriate in full to the threat we're facing. for defense of our motherland, its sovereignty and territorial integrity, to ensure the security of our people, and in the freed territories, I deem it necessary to support the proposal of the Ministry of Defense and the General Command for partial mobilization held in the Russian Federation. I stress it is partial mobilization. Only those who are currently in reserve will be conscripted, and also those who served in the army have certain military professions and will be always given additional military training, taking into account the special military operation. The decree of partial mobilization has been signed. Officially, the chambers of the Federal Assembly and the State Duma will be informed. The mobilization events shall start today on the 21st of September. I tasked the heads of regions to provide all the necessary assistance to the military commissariats. I shall stress that Russian citizens called up as a part of mobilization will be given all the guarantees, all the benefits of those serving under contract. The decree of partial mobilization encompasses additional measures to defend the state procurement for defense concerning the military technology and additional capacities for its production, or the financial matters for supplying the defense factories shall be resolved by the government without delay. In its aggressive anti-Russian policy, the West has crossed all lines. We constantly hear threats against our people, and some irresponsible politicians in the West are speaking not just of the plans of providing Ukraine with long-range military systems that would be able to hit the regions of Russia. That is already happening. We're talking about the border areas, including the Belgorod region, and the systems using strategic drones, planes, doing reconnaissance across the whole of the Russian south. And there are plans in Washington and Brussels to move the military action onto the Russian territory. They're not just talking about Russia being completely destroyed at the battlefield, talking about political, cultural, and all the types of sovereignty with complete pillage. Now they're talking about nuclear blackmail. The Zaporozhye nuclear power plant was shelled. And also some high-positioned representatives of leading NATO states were saying that there might be possibility and permissibility to use nuclear weapons against Russia. Those that allow such statements shall be reminded that our country also has various weapons of destruction. And with regard to certain components, they're even more modern than the NATO ones. And if there is a threat to the territorial integrity of our country and for protecting our people, we will certainly use all the means available to us. And I'm not bluffing. Russian citizens can be certain that the territorial integrity of our motherland, our freedom and independence shall be secured. I shall stress by all means available to us. And those trying to blackmail us with nuclear weapons should know that the tables can turn on them. In our historic tradition, our people had it in their destiny to stop those who are trying to subjugate our motherland and divide it. And we will do that now. It will happen. I believe in your support.
Goodness, some quotes there from President Putin, reminding the West that Russia has modern weapons of destruction. He went on to say, "I'm not bluffing." He also talked about conscription for some Russian citizens with military background. Diana's been listening. Goodness, Diana, good morning.
Hi, Kay. Well, it takes some listening to that speech, doesn't it? He started off once again. You really feel his paranoia, his kind of persecution complex, talking all about how for a long time this has been the Western effort to destroy and undermine Russia, explaining why his special military operation has to continue, the kind of pressure that the neo-Nazis, as he called them, was exerting on the people of Ukraine and the people of historic Novorossiya, that old word to describe the regions that are now going to be holding referendums, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk and Luhansk. And how Russia was on the right course to protect them, but he needed to take various steps, which I think a lot of analysts were anticipating, that at some point he was going to have to solve his manpower problem on the battlefield. And he has announced a partial mobilization of Russia's reserve forces. So we don't know exactly who, but those who did do military service. You can do military service here, but there are exceptions. So I suppose those who did military service will be called up. That starts today. The referendums are going to be from Friday until the following Tuesday, 4 days of voting. And he gave a very stark warning at the end that he would use nuclear weapons if the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country was threatened, saying that it was the West who had raised the spectre of nuclear weapons. They haven't. And saying that if they continued to blackmail Russia in nuclear, with sort of nuclear ways, then they should be aware that he would strike back, talking about the range of weapons that he has at his disposal, saying, "I am not bluffing." Very clear warning there from Vladimir Putin that he will escalate if he deems it necessary, trying to reinforce to his people that what he is doing is saving the people of Donbass from the terrible repressive regime, as he called it, of Ukraine, which he always says is a proxy of the West, and to save the Russian people. This was all a sort of messianic speech about how the West is out to destroy Russia, and what he is doing is in the name of saving Russia. So we have partial mobilization now, and again, that very strong threat that he will use nuclear weapons if he deems it necessary.
OK, Diana, for now, we will come back to you. Thanks so much indeed. Lucky to have the Foreign Office Minister with us, Gillian Keegan. Good morning.
Morning,
I know
Kay.
that you were listening to what he had to say.
Yes. Well, it's quite obviously a worrying escalation, particularly the last comments there, but and rather a rewriting of history, I think, as well, in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. So let me be clear, these are Putin's lies. He's continuing to completely misrepresent what's happened in Ukraine. It's an illegal war in Ukraine. It's Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. And of course, we will still stand by Ukraine, as will all of our NATO allies. But yes, some of the language there was quite concerning at the end, and obviously we would urge for calm.
How gravely should we take his threat that he's not bluffing about the potential to use nuclear weapons?
Well, clearly, you know, it's something that we should take very seriously, because, you know, we're not in control. I'm not sure he's in control either, really. I mean, this is obviously an escalation. And of course, to the Russian people now, who will be conscripted into this war. And it's hard to know what's going on in Russia as well. Obviously, they don't have a free media like we can talk freely here. So that's also difficult. But we've been very clear all along. And in fact, the speech that the Prime Minister will give today is going to double down and say we will absolutely continue to support Ukraine, and we will invest, well, we've already put £2.3 billion to supporting the military aid in Ukraine and other aid in Ukraine, and we'll do the same next year to continue.
What's our message, what's the government's message to the people of Ukraine this morning, and also to the people of Russia?
Well, the people of Ukraine, you know, it's the same message. We're there, we're by your side, we will help as much as we possibly can. They're incredibly brave, and of course we've also seen that they've made some significant progress in the last couple of weeks and few days indeed as well, which has probably prompted this speech. To the Russian people, look beyond your own media. It's very, very clear. The whole global population is very clear what's going on in Ukraine. We can all see what's going on in Ukraine. You know, there's lots and lots of footage. And in fact, in Izium, we've now seen some war crimes, some evidence of war crimes, which is also why we've set up the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group to try and make sure that we can help to make sure that we capture that. So there are definitely war crimes and evidence of sexual violence as well.
I know that we only have a truncated time with you this morning, obviously because of listening to President Putin. Why did Liz Truss feel the need to go to New York? She's having a bilateral, she's having face-to-face talks with Biden. She could have had that here, and there's no trade deal on the table.
Oh, no, I mean, there's lots of world leaders in New York. In fact, pretty much lots of people who came here to go to Her Majesty's funeral, pretty much all of them went on the plane. There's lots of things to be discussed. There's lots of bilaterals that will be taking place, obviously one with President Biden. And she also will be giving a speech, which is an important forum in foreign policy terms, to be able to say, look, this is what we're going to do, and to show that leadership on the global stage, that we will be there continually supporting Ukraine. So I think that is important, and it's the place to do it. And actually, I think possibly the timing of this speech and the fact that the world leaders are all there together is probably the right place to be right now.
Exactly, and sulking because he wasn't invited to the funeral, some might say, I don't know. Talk to me about the cost of living crisis briefly before I let you go. One question on businesses getting support from the 1st of October. It's not very far away.
Yes, and Friday's when we'll hear more, so that's not very far away as well. So, today you'll hear more on businesses, and then Friday you'll hear more from the Chancellor as well in terms of support. I mean, this is the first time, actually, that there has been a support for businesses on the energy crisis. Obviously, there's been lots of support for businesses during the past couple of years with coronavirus, but we do recognise that there's lots of small businesses who have been hit with massive energy bills as well. Again, as a result of this war in Ukraine. You know, this has had massive impacts, not as big as it's had on the people of Ukraine, but certainly having a lot of impact on people here and on businesses here. And of course, we need to be there to support them. So we've already announced a big package for people, and there'll be a similar package for 6 months, I think, for businesses. But then there'll be more targeted support for specific industries that are more vulnerable to the increase in energy prices. OK, and the front page of the Times this morning suggesting that stamp duty is going to be reduced on Friday. People are exchanging on a house today. Should they wait till Friday? Well, they'll have to wait and hear what the Chancellor says on Friday, so obviously I can't tell people. And you always get this when you've got changes, etc. But what I will say is that Friday we'll be announcing pro-growth, pro-business, really trying to really boost the growth in our economy, which obviously has suffered from many of the shocks that we've had with coronavirus and obviously dealing with this war as well. So now's the time to really try and focus on that and ensure that we're in good shape, really, for the future. And offer support to people where you can. It's good to talk to you. Thanks for bearing with us this morning. Thank you. Always a pleasure. Thank you. So we've just heard from President Putin. He has been talking within the last few moments. Quite startling, some of his terminology, not least. He was talking about nuclear weapons. And he says that his nuclear weapons are much more modern than those in the West. He isn't afraid to use them, and he is not bluffing. Ali's here. Wow, Ali, good morning.
Yeah, I mean, we've been waiting a while for this statement from President Putin. We expected it last night. It's obviously rare for him to address the world in this way. And as you say, a pretty startling tone from him. And Gillian Keegan today talking about his concerning language when he said he wasn't bluffing when he talked about nuclear weapons. She said that Putin was lying, and she's made clear that the UK will double down. That certainly echoes what we've heard from Liz Truss in the last 24 hours, because of course she's saying that we're going to continue to support Ukraine to the tune of £2.5 billion next year, the same as this year. She's talked about, if Russia wants to be part of the international field again, them having to pay for reparations for the invasion. Clearly, that is a long way off the tone from Vladimir Putin this morning.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure how she's going to get him to do that, given that he's talking about using nuclear weapons. Also, partial mobilisation.
Yes, so a partial mobilisation, they said that is from today. And of course, we also have these votes in those 4 areas, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, on whether they, and these are not seen as legitimate, like Russian-backed officials, on whether they should be part of Russia. So
basically, it's a referendum in those areas that have been taken by Russia for people there to say whether or not they want to be Russian.
Yeah, that's right. And President Putin is saying today that his aim is to liberate Donbass. But as you say, he has announced a partial military mobilisation. So that will be reserve forces. We don't know exactly what he means by that, but that will start today. So clearly, I think, an escalation potentially that the West will be really quite worried about.
Yeah, indeed. So for now, let's just digest that a little bit more. And I know that we're going to chat to you about the cost of living crisis as well in a short while. Indeed, lots to talk about. And Ali's take at 9 o'clock. Look forward to it. Thanks very much indeed. Well, as we were discussing with the Minister, the government will reveal this morning how it plans to help businesses struggling to cope with rising energy prices. It's expected that businesses in Britain and Northern Ireland will receive a discount on energy bills funded by taxpayer subsidy. Industry sources have told Sky News that it will be a universal scheme which will apply to all sectors of the economy rather than a targeted programme of support. The scheme, which will run for 6 months from the 1st of October, is expected to cost more than £20 billion. Beth Rigby has been speaking to the Prime Minister about her plans for economic growth from the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York.
Labour's policy to tax the energy companies is supported by 68% of the public, according to polls. You're prepared to be unpopular, aren't you?
Yes, I am. What is important to me is that we grow the British economy. That is what will ultimately deliver more money into people's pockets. And in order to get that economic growth, Britain has to be competitive. And if we put up taxes, if we have arbitrary taxes on energy companies, if we have high corporation tax, we're not going to get that investment and growth, which will ultimately damage opportunities in this country. And that's what I'm bothered about.
Fraser Moord is at a bakery in York this morning, which is struggling to cope with rising bills. There's new data today from the debt charity Money Advice Trust suggests nearly 11 million people in the UK have fallen behind in at least one bill payment. With us now, as I said, good morning to you. How are they coping there?
Good morning, Kay. Well, I'd love to show you racks of lovely pastries, of brownies, flapjacks, cakes and so on here at Costello's Bakery, but all the baking gets done in the middle of the night now to try and keep their energy costs down, and it still hasn't been enough. 3 shops the Costellos have, and all 3 have had to close. They've just managed to keep this bakery base here open. Louise Costello, been in business for 23 years, 3 shops, they've all had to close. It's grim stuff.
It is, it's absolutely devastating. So, yeah, we're here at the bakery. We supplied our 3 shops, one in Malton, Driffield and Wetherby, but the electric costs were just too high just for us to continue. So we've just made the decision a couple of weeks ago that we've closed all 3 now. So we're keeping the bakery going, but unfortunately we've had to close all 3 shops.
So in terms of those costs, what are they? How bad is it?
So overall as a business, taking the bakery and the shops all together, we were paying about £1,600 a month, and it's gone up to just under £9,000. I think it's £8,750 like collectively, which is just unbelievable and just too much. We're only a small business, we just don't have that kind of cash flow in the business.
And what's it meant staffing-wise and to those local economies where you've had to close?
We've had to close the 3 shops, so we've lost about 20 staff in total of the shops altogether. It's really sad. Really didn't want to have to let them go. We've had to reduce the staff here as well. As you say, we're now trying to do all the baking overnight, which has disrupted the bakery. But yeah, really sad to the shops. My husband, he opened the first shop 24 years ago. We've worked so hard together. Like I say, we're a small family business. The time and everything we put into doing them, it's just really sad that we've had to let them go.
OK, Louise. Well, look, really sorry to hear that. So 3 of the shops down. So the hope is that they can regroup from this base here, hopefully work online and try and diversify, find some other way of keeping the business going after 23 years.
OK, indeed. For now, thanks very much. Well, on the cost of living crisis, the Mail says freedom begins with tax cuts. Trust signals a profound shift in policy, writes the FT. on possible tax cuts. Let's have a look at that. There you go, front page of the FT this morning. And the Eye also leads with this story with the headline, Mortgage Rate Shock as Truss Cuts UK Taxes. The new PM to cut stamp duty in push for prosperity is the Times front page. The Guardian says Biden rejected the new PM's embrace of Reaganite tax policies. The Telegraph leads with the war in Ukraine, reporting Putin set to declare occupied land part of Russia. A thoroughly modern monarchy for King Charles, says the Mirror. The Express says the public backs this move for a slimmed-back monarchy. And the Metro has the new King and Queen consort returning to Balmoral to continue their mourning in private. The Sun has the queue-jumping saga involving This Morning television hosts Holly Willoughby and Phil Schofield. And the Star reports thousands sign a petition to get the pair axed. Well, Buckingham Palace has revealed the Queen's name has been inscribed alongside her mother's, father's and husband's on the ledger stone in the Windsor Chapel where she was buried. Buckingham Palace has revealed details of the Queen's final resting place. Her name has been added on a stone in the chapel at Windsor Castle, where she was buried on Monday. She was laid to rest with her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, in the George VI Memorial Chapel, alongside her parents and the ashes of her sister. Other headlines for you on the programme this morning. In Iran, protests have continued following the death of a young woman held by the morality police. Women have posted videos of themselves cutting their hair, while others have burnt their hijabs in the street. It follows the deaths of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini after she was arrested in Tehran, accused of breaking the law requiring women to cover their hair with a hijab. And with parts of the world experiencing extreme weather conditions, let's have a quick look at the impact of climate change on the planet. Right half of the screen shows how the UK's power is currently being produced. Less coal today than we were using yesterday. Renewables 12.4%, 1% of imports. Right-hand side at the top, how high the temperatures have increased since figures in 1880, and below that 1.258 degrees, and below that the CO2 emissions in real time in millions of tonnes. Well, let's bear that in mind when we talk about a TV weather forecaster in the United States who got a shock when the severe weather he had been predicting interrupted his own broadcast.
Here's our studio here that has several inches of water. Is it in the newsroom? It's gone through the door. It's in the newsroom. It looks like it's going down the hall. Okay, yeah. So it's actually through a lot of the studio here, into the newsroom, into our control room. I can't believe that we're still even able to do what we're doing here right now.
Several inches of water, that cameraman's shoes, the soil must be pretty thick. Kevin Lighty was on air as the chief meteorologist at WCIA3 television in Illinois, just as he was warning viewers about severe thunderstorms and the risk of supersized hail. The weather system hit the station and flooded the studio. Around an inch of water fell on the building, but Kevin and colleagues at WCIA3 stayed on air throughout. Good on them. Now, an investigation by Sky News has revealed fake sweets containing cannabis are on sale on most social media platforms. Police in southern England have told us that they believe young boys and girls are already buying them. Here's Aisha with more.
They may look like big brand name sweets, but look closer and you'll see subtle differences in packaging, but big differences in what they contain. These illegal sweets have substances like cannabis in them, and police say they're ending up in the hands of children.
These sweets are widely promoted and sold online. They appear virtually everywhere. Sky News found them on all major social media platforms, including Instagram, TikTok and Facebook. And on Facebook alone, when we searched the term edibles on Marketplace, around a third of the results that came up contained drugs.
It's something that's causing problems for most police forces around the country. Police in the east and southeast of England have shared exclusive information with us suggesting that it's boys and girls consuming cannabis edibles. These boys and girls tend to be of secondary school age, and of people they've arrested, a third were under the age of 18. These illegal sweets contain something called THC, the ingredient in cannabis which gives the user a high. For children, side effects from it can be incredibly harmful.
cannabis damages mood, memory, and motivation. Now, that's a terrible effect in young children, to damage their mood, memory, and motivation. And the other thing about cannabis is that it's a gateway drug. It's sold in county lines, and the same people are selling acid, ecstasy, cocaine, heroin.
There's also concern that consumption of these illegal sweets is rising.
One of the things we know is that their sale is on the increase. There seems to be more and more of them coming onto the market. I think one of the things we are aware of is that there has been some recent hospitalisations of children who've been consuming these products.
Meta, who own Instagram, Facebook and WhatsApp, said they proactively removed 98% of this content in the last quarter, and that they're working with police and youth organisations to further improve their moderation. Aisha Zahid, Sky News.
We've just been hearing from the Russian President Vladimir Putin, who announced a partial mobilization beginning today with reservists being conscripted. He also warned the West that Moscow will respond with all the means at its disposal if Russia's territory is threatened.
Today, our army, as I said, is acting at the military front line, exceeding 1,000 kilometers, and they are facing not just the neo-Nazis, but the whole military machine of the collective West. In this situation, I deem it's necessary to make the following decision, which is appropriate in full to the threat we're facing. For defense of our motherland, its sovereignty and territorial integrity, to ensure the security of our people, and in the freed territories, I deem it necessary to support the proposal of the Ministry of Defense and the General Command for partial mobilization held in the Russian Federation. I stress it is partial mobilization. Only those who are currently in reserve will be conscripted, and also those who served in the army have certain military professions and will be always given additional military training, taking into account the special military operation. The decree of partial mobilization has been signed. Officially, the chambers of the Federal Assembly and the State Duma will be informed. The mobilization events shall start today on the 21st of September. I tasked the heads of regions to provide all the necessary assistance to the military commissariats. I shall stress that Russian citizens called up as a part of mobilization will be given all the guarantees, all the benefits of those serving under contract. There are plans in Washington and Brussels to move the military action onto the Russian territory. They're not just talking about Russia being completely destroyed at battlefield, talking about political, cultural, and all the types of sovereignty with complete pillage. Now they're talking about nuclear blackmail. The Zaporozhye nuclear power plant was shelled. And also some high-positioned representatives of leading NATO states were saying that there might be possibility and permissibility to use nuclear weapons against Russia. Those that allow such statements shall be reminded that our country also has various weapons of destruction. And with regard to certain components, they're even more modern than the NATO ones. And if there is a threat to the territorial integrity of our country and for protecting our people, we will certainly use all the means available to us. And I'm not bluffing.
So there, British Ambassador to Russia, Sir Tony Brenton is with us now. Hi, Sir Tony. I know you took the opportunity to listen to what President Putin had to say. Your initial thoughts for us, please, this morning.
Well, it's a pretty significant escalation. I mean, Russia so far has been fighting this war with one hand tied behind its back. They refused to mobilize because Putin was worried about the effect on Russian public opinion, and they were losing the war. And what Putin has now announced is the mobilization, which he's been refusing to do since the war began, and has now accepted the advice of his military, and has come back to the nuclear threat in the context of alleged nuclear threats from the West. Now, I don't know whether he believes that or not, but it is obviously a very significant step up in the rhetoric that's going on.
I personally haven't heard nuclear threats from the West, but obviously he was making that speech for local as well as international consumption. When we talk about...
I haven't either, but what he did refer to is the shelling of Zaporizhzhia nuclear reactor. And that was certainly done by Ukraine and certainly constituted a nuclear danger.
Understood. He also talked about referenda in certain areas of Ukraine. Perhaps you could reflect on that for us as well, if you would, please.
Yes, of course. The background to this speech, in fact, is very fast moves now, that in 4 regions of Ukraine, in the east, there are to be referenda in effect this weekend, which will ask the question, do you want to become part of Russia? Referenda in these circumstances are obviously not very honest things, and the outcome is pretty clear that they will say yes. We in the West will say that these are fake referenda and will resist them. But if Putin wants to proceed to annex these provinces, these referenda will give him the pretext to do so. And indeed, a lot of the statements he's just made is about his determination to protect what he sees as part of the Russian-speaking world from what he sees as Nazi Ukrainian control.
So what impact will these announcements have on the war in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, the first thing I should say is, of course, that Ukrainians, not knowing what Putin was going to say, yesterday were saying he can make all the noise he likes, we're winning the war, and we're going to carry on and win the war. And they have good reasons for confidence in doing that. On the other hand, and I simply don't know, I'm not a military expert, I'm sure you have someone you can talk to, what difference the mobilization of the reserves will make, because the reserves will no doubt need some training, it will take time to get to the battlefield, and so on. The main point, I think, though, is that in the eyes of the Russian public, what has so far been described to them rather mildly as a special military operation is now becoming much, much closer to being a real war. And therefore, it becomes that much more difficult for the Russian authorities to pull back, to surrender, to make major concessions in any negotiations which may come.
I mean, how should we interpret this? Is it that they are losing so many military personnel, also known as losing the war, and this is why he's ratcheting up matters?
Yeah, loss of personnel, loss of equipment, but loss of political support, not in any huge way. The vast majority of the Russian people are pretty stolid and support Putin. But a rather important segment of Russian opinion makers, which is the right wing, the veterans, the nationalists, whom Putin, if Putin has a natural constituency, that's them, have become very critical of the defeats, particularly 2 weeks ago, near Kharkiv in the north of Ukraine. And a lot of what this statement is about is feeding red meat to that constituency, that he is determined to go ahead and take whatever measures are necessary to win the war.
As I'm chatting to you, I'm reflecting on Crimea and the annexation of Crimea. I mean, I'm trying to second guess what must be in Putin's mind when he's rushing through these so-called annexations of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. Is he trying to put his thumbprint on that so that when the war does end, he can claim them as he has Crimea? I mean, that was back in 2014, still under Russian control.
Well, he says he's protecting the Russian-speaking populations there, and he's talked in the past about genocide, absurd word, of the Ukrainian occupation. They are not as attached to these provinces as they are to Crimea. And if it comes to a negotiation, then bits of them, I'm sure they will be willing to forego. There have been other hints, not obviously visible in the context of this speech, but for example, President Erdogan of Turkey, who is in New York with our Prime Minister and a lot of other leading politicians at the moment, has said he believes the Russians want to talk. And I suspect that part of the background to this speech is precisely to pressure the West, to pressure Ukraine initially, to come back to the conference table as a way of beginning to resolve things.
Okay. How powerful is he within his own country?
Oh, I mean, he's not a complete totalitarian dictator. I mean, it's been quite interesting watching the evolution of this speech. I was following it yesterday, and it was announced for yesterday evening and then postponed and postponed and postponed, and finally only took place this morning. Now, the background to that has to be an intense catfight within the top of the Russian administration about what measures he would announce and what words he would use. Now, it looks as if the right wing, the nationalists, have won that particular battle, but it does mean that there is debate at the top of the Russian administration about where they want all this to go.
Okay, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the programme this morning. Thank you, Sir Tony. So if you are just tuning our way, we've been hearing from President Putin within the last few moments. He has talked about a partial mobilization of military in Russia, and that will include not only the reservists, but also those that have previous military experience. He also talked about the annexation of certain areas of Ukraine, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, where he wants referenda held in 2 days' time, and suggesting that they would then become part of Russia to protect the people that live there. And perhaps most alarmingly, he talked about the threat of, although he didn't say nuclear weapons in the same sentence, he talked about modern weapons that were much more modern than those in the West. And if the West continued to threaten nuclear weapons, then he would turn to his own weapons. He went on to say, "I'm not bluffing." Well, despite Russia's intention to push ahead with the referenda in the occupied parts of Ukraine, the Ukrainian armed forces are pushing ahead with their own counteroffensive. They are continuing to push two fronts in the northeast near Kharkiv and in the south near Kherson. In the northeast, having already taken an area half the size of Wales, in Kharkiv, Ukrainian forces are continuing local offensive operations across the Oskil River in the Luhansk area. Luhansk is almost totally occupied by Russia, while Donetsk only partially. Russia-backed separatists in both regions have announced 2 referenda there this weekend. Moscow-backed leaders in the Russian-occupied Kherson region, along with the partially occupied Zaporizhia region, have joined calls for a referendum which would allow them to join Russia. That would allow the Kremlin to secure its gains in Ukraine. Our chief international correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, reports from the border.
The southern counter-offensive goes on. Artillery pound Russian positions a few miles away. This flat land leading towards the city of Kherson is a battlefield dominated by artillery and rockets. It's why the counterattack is moving more slowly down here than the Ukrainian efforts in the north. Tank battalions manoeuvre towards the front line to support infantry. Behind them, the main defensive line is held by miles of dug-in and camouflaged tank and artillery positions. Their job is to combat any sudden Russian fightback. They load their tanks with personalized shells. From Mikolo to Moskals, it says, a gift from Ukrainians to Russians. But this offensive comes at a cost in lost lives. Medics prepare for their shift, rescuing people injured at the front. The casualties, they say, can on some days be very high. The reason is simple. The Russians knew they were coming.
Точно що відомо, що після вдалого наступу на Харківському напрямку росіяни намагаються перекрити усі варіанти наступу на Крим.
Sky News was allowed to travel to the defensive positions supporting the counterattack. The drive through the farmlands of the south is eerie and dangerous. The supply routes are constantly attacked. It's why anything that shows where we are could be targeted by the Russian forces.
Well, there are soldiers absolutely everywhere, but such is the level of secrecy about this counter-offensive that the military won't be filmed and they won't let us go to any of their positions. We're only about 14 miles or so from the front line of the offence. This is the main defensive position for the Ukrainian position. As I say, they're trying to really keep a wraps on what exactly is happening as they try to get into Kherson city.
It's remarkable, but some civilians always stay in these towns at the centre of the fighting. Area Commander Major Sergei Sohotsky, originally from Crimea, keeps an eye out for people like 60-year-old Luba. We asked her what the counter-offensive was like. It smells like victory, she said. Luba, like all Ukrainians, is optimistic, but the noises from the Kremlin are ominous. This conflict could so easily escalate, and that means nobody here is safe. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, Southern Ukraine.
Returning to the situation in Ukraine and the words from President Putin within the last hour in just a few moments' time, but also want to reflect on what's happening here at home. And new research has found almost 2 in 5 children in the northeast are living in poverty, and there is now a growing chasm between government commitments on levelling up and child poverty in the region. Joined by Amanda Bailey, she's Director of the North East Child Poverty Commission. Hello to you, Amanda. Thank you for joining us. Just how bad is it for some kids up in the northeast?
So, as you said, we know that almost 2 in 5 children across the region are growing up in poverty now, and actually that rate's even higher for the youngest children. It's almost half of children living in a family with an under 5. That's the highest rate of anywhere in the whole of the country. And critically, we've seen the steepest increases in child poverty in recent years, and that's a long-term trend that we find predates the current cost of living crisis, predates the COVID pandemic, and clearly began around 2014-15. So this is a longer-term issue for the region. And the really big worry is that despite the sort of really welcome commitments we've had around levelling up, around improving life chances and living standards for children and young people in places like the northeast, actually the child poverty gap between the northeast child poverty rate and that of the UK average is now at a 20-year high, and that gap is widening. It's not getting better. So really, as you said, we're highlighting really there's a growing chasm between what have been welcome commitments on levelling up places like the northeast and the reality of rising child poverty in every part of the northeast, which has continued to go up in every year since 2014.
Why is there such a disparity in different parts of the country?
So for our region, and the research that we published today really looks at what is that combination of factors that means that child poverty is now so high in the region and has risen so steeply in recent years. One of the big issues for us is the prevalence of low-paid work. So that the majority of children growing up in poverty, both across the UK and in the northeast, are in working families. But that increase in in-work poverty that's been seen across the country, actually, we've seen a much steeper increase in in-work poverty than the rest of the UK. We also haven't experienced the fall in out-of-work poverty that has been seen across the country. And we've seen a higher increase in a number of families where it may be that they're not in a position to work because of disabilities or caring responsibilities, or find it much harder to work without the right support in place. And crucially, I think all of those issues mean that the northeast has been disproportionately impacted, particularly families with children have been disproportionately impacted by the erosion of our national social security safety net that's taken place over the last decade. We've really highlighted in the research today that disproportionate impact for families who are both in work and out of work is actually driving many of the inequalities that the levelling up agenda now seeks to tackle. And until that erosion of our national social security system is addressed, levelling up will not be meaningfully achieved for places like the northeast.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.